Minasan konnichiwa.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Today we have one of the best translators in Japan, so I am going to speak in English today. But if we have a question and answer period, maybe I'll try my Japanese later. Today I would like to talk with you about some of the responses in Germany to crises and how you overcome crises and think about how to make sure crises don't happen and what to do to look towards the future. There we go. So if we look at history, there are actually many very, very serious environmental crises that we've had. Here in Japan, there's been the Minamata disaster. There have been disasters in Italy, the Seveso chemical plant explosion that led to serious pollution of rivers in Europe. Not so long ago, maybe a decade ago, a very serious accident in Romania, considered the second most serious accident after Chernobyl, when cyanide entered into the rivers after a dam near a gold mine exploded. And so we had very, very serious pollution problems in Europe after this. In the United States, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. We've seen in China, accident after accident, very serious pollution problems that have emerged, such as the explosion that led to pollution with dioxin of the rivers heading into Russia. So there too, very serious pollution problems. But today I think we have a special focus, a focus on a certain very unique kind of disaster, nuclear disasters. And of course we don't have so much experience with them, and of course we can be grateful that we don't have so much experience with them. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how in Germany we responded to the nuclear disasters. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster is something I think we'll hear more about from our Ukrainian colleagues. But I would like to talk to you about it in the perspective of how it was viewed in Germany. The Chernobyl accident is something that Germany did not learn about on the day of the explosion. It was 3 days later that Germany first learned that the nuclear explosion had happened. And so, in fact, when Fukushima happened, there were many comparisons being made between what happened after Chernobyl and what happened after Fukushima in terms of information disclosure. And of course, there was much more information disclosure after Fukushima, but also in many cases insufficient information disclosure. And so in Germany, there were sometimes questions about what have we really learned from Chernobyl? Have we learned enough in the case of Fukushima? The Fukushima nuclear accident, the Chernobyl nuclear accident sent a radioactive plume that traveled over much of Europe. And here we see a very simplified graph of some of the regions that were impacted by the nuclear fallout. And one of the things you can see in this graph is that Germany was one of the countries that was impacted by the radioactive fallout after Chernobyl. The radioactive fallout in Germany was not as serious as it was in Scandinavia, and certainly not as serious as it was in the Ukraine. But nevertheless, Germany too experienced radioactive fallout. If you look at this graph, this was produced in 1998, and it shows you areas where you have had radioactive cesium deposits, cesium-137. And the deep dark red areas are the ones where you have had the worst fallout. And you see those aren't Germany. Nevertheless, there was still some damage, especially in southern Germany, and that impacted people's consciousness very much. If you look at the press from Germany at that time, right after the nuclear accident, you realize how little information people really had about what does a radioactive disaster mean? What can you and what can't you do? So the titles of these articles, they talk about don't let your children play in the hot sand. Be careful about eating mushrooms and don't drink the milk. If you deep freeze the vegetables, it won't help. If you cook the vegetables, it won't help. And if we think about this information today, we realize that a lot of the information was very, very simplified and not always accurate information that was making it into the newspapers, in part because it was an accident for which we had had no planning and no preparation also on the part of the media. And I think there's some similarities in the case of Fukushima, and we hear that still today. People don't really know what to make of the accident, what to make of a lot of the information that they have heard, and people are very scared. I still today hear people say, is it safe to go to Japan? Are you really going to Japan? Is it okay? Can you eat the food coming from the region? And I think in a way it's a signal that we really need to do more to communicate also information about risks. What are the real risks, and which are the risks that are perhaps more stories than actual risks? But today in Germany, we are still told, and I don't think these are just media stories, they are still real risks, not to eat certain things. 2% roughly of the wild boar in the region has radioactive levels that make it dangerous to eat. So there's regular testing still in Germany of wild boar for radioactivity levels. There are some regions in Germany where mushrooms are still considered not safe for consumption, and people are advised not to do mushroom picking in certain areas where there was cesium fallout. And in a very few cases, you hear concerns about whether or not some vegetables grown in some regions might be problematic. Because Germany had the experience of Chernobyl, when the Fukushima nuclear accident happened, it resonated in a very deep way in Germany. Germany had already decided after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, not directly afterwards, but a decade later, that it would phase out of nuclear energy. The Fukushima nuclear accident reinforced that decision and emphasized for many Germans that they wanted to think about a new path in their energy development. The Fukushima nuclear accident was not received with the same kind of concern in neighboring France as in Germany, which is also something I think that's worth thinking about. Why are France and Germany responding so differently to the nuclear accident? And I think there's a few reasons behind it. One is certainly the difference in the percentage of electricity that's coming from nuclear. In France, it's a much larger industry than in Germany. But I also think it has a lot to do with the reality of the Chernobyl memories. The Chernobyl memories were much stronger in Germany than in France. Right after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, you did not have the same kind of media communication and the same level of non-governmental organization movements against the nuclear industry as you had in Germany. And of course, Germany was also in a different situation than France. Germany at the time of Chernobyl was in the middle of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and there was considerable concern in Germany that a third world war could eventually happen, and if it did, that Germany would be the place where that war would begin. So the responses to Chernobyl were different, and we see similar kinds of differences in the responses to the Fukushima nuclear accident. I became a member of the Ethics Commission for a Safe Energy Future that was established 2 weeks after the Fukushima nuclear accident. To this day, I don't really know why I was invited to be a member of the Ethics Commission. I presume it's because I've been doing 30 years of research on climate and energy issues, not from a natural science, but from a social science perspective. And also because I had had experience in Japan before, and perhaps they were interested in having that perspective in the Ethics Commission as well. But what was interesting with the Ethics Commission is that we were asked to think about what kind of energy future we should think about in light of the Fukushima nuclear accident. And today what I'd like to do is emphasize within this report those aspects that were discussed that focus on the importance of communication and the focus on the question of developing a national understanding of where we want to go, how we want to develop our energy futures. In the report, there's considerable discussion about the importance of society deciding where it wants to move forward in collaboration with scientific understanding of what kinds of possibilities are available to a society. And there was also a lot of focus on understanding how to move forward towards a world that might be one that would produce a consensus behind a more sustainable path that could perhaps also present a model to other countries of other alternatives in energy futures. So the Ethics Commission report was an opportunity for a group of scientists, but not natural scientists, primarily social scientists, to add voice to thinking about what kind of energy futures are possible. And in the report, based on information that had been developed by other scientists over the years, we recommended that it was possible for Germany to move forward with the development of renewable energies and to think more about what can be done to enhance energy efficiency and energy saving and shift away towards, or shift in the direction of a more environmentally friendly energy system. Perhaps interestingly for all of you, Germany has a new coalition government. It was elected in the fall of last year. It is a grand coalition between the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party. And it is such a large coalition that it means that the opposition parties have no voice. They are not allowed to make amendments in Parliament because they're too small in terms of their size. So this is really the two parties that are determining energy policy for Germany today. And just a few weeks ago, in the beginning of January of this year, the new Ministry of Economics and Energy, the minister is from the Social Democratic Party, Mr. Gabriel, introduced a new policy idea for the energy plans of Germany. And it is very similar to the plan of the previous government, but with a few differences. One of the differences is that they've established some new interim goals for Germany's energy development. And one is that by 2025, 40 to 45% of Germany's electricity should come from renewables. And that by 2035, 55 to 60% of the electricity should come from renewables. And if you ask where do these figures come from, they come from the inputs of both community experts, different communities that themselves have pushed very hard for the development of alternative energies, as well as out of the academies that we were just talking about in the previous presentation. So Germany is doing what they call an Energiewende, an energy transition, out of the fossil fuel and nuclear energy dominant system of the past to a new system that we've never seen before in a major industrialized country, one that's based on renewables and energy efficiency. Although there's an expectation that we will continue to rely on nuclear for another decade, that we will continue to use coal for several decades, and that natural gas will be an important transition fuel as well. So the ruling coalition is continuing a path forward despite some criticism or critique or some questions as to whether or not Germany can really do it. And I thought it might be useful to take a look here at this graph that shows you what's going on now with electricity production in Germany. Germany has shifted from, oh dear, whoops, a system in 2009 where there was considerably more nuclear energy in the system to one where renewables are now greater than the nuclear energy input into the system. And the transition has been very rapid since the Fukushima nuclear accident, because right after the accident, Germany shut down 8 of its nuclear power plants, and it only has 9 left. The next one is expected to be shut down in 2015, and then in a few years' time, another one in 2017. So this is the energy transition that's going on. People do raise questions about whether or not this is an energy transition that is affordable. And there is concern that it's an expensive transition, that renewable energies are more costly. But what we are seeing is that the prices, for example, of electricity produced from photovoltaics has dropped dramatically. So that today photovoltaics in some cases could actually be market competitive even without a feed-in tariff support system. And that's the same for onshore wind, although not yet for offshore wind and not yet for all kinds of photovoltaics. It's also not yet the case for geothermal energy. So the costs of renewables are going down. But nevertheless, what we will also see, and this is very much a part of community discussion, is a reconsideration of how renewable energies are supported in the system so that it does not become too expensive. We've seen a very dramatic rise in electricity prices in the last few years because of the support scheme for renewables. So there's a wide understanding that that support scheme needs to change. If you look at the electricity mix in Germany today, you see the increasing share of renewables, which is photovoltaics, hydropower, biomass, and wind energy, a declining share on the nuclear, but also still an extremely large share of coal. And this is another big challenge that we have right now. Germany's CO2 emissions are rising, and that goes against the plans that Germany has to reduce its CO2 emissions by 40% of 1990 levels by 2020. Today, they're about 23% below 1990 levels, so it still has a ways to go. And it has an 80% CO2 emission reduction target for 2050. One reason that the CO2 emissions are increasing is because Germany has been producing more electricity from coal, partly for export to France and Austria and Denmark. So Germany right now is exporting more energy, more electricity than it has in the last 5 years. And it has had a export surplus also to France. But this can't continue. So one of the big challenges will be how to increase the price of coal to make coal less attractive, and in the process to keep the push on renewable energy moving forward. And thinking about the situation in Fukushima, I think it's very important to understand that the push towards an energy transition in Germany is not one that was started by decision makers in Bonn or Berlin. It was started by decision makers in households, in communities, in non-governmental organizations. It was very much a push from below. And it was communities at the local level that said, we want a different system, and we're not getting fast enough response from national decision makers, so we're going to start to do it on our own. And those first communities began to do those transitions already back in the 1970s, but we have seen a very rapid growth in the number of communities that are now 100% renewable energy communities. One such community is outside of Berlin. It's called Siebenlinden. And as you can see, every household has photovoltaics on their roof, and they do a lot of biomass. Or another small community outside of Berlin, Feldheim, that also decided years ago that it wanted to become a sustainable community and has invested very heavily in renewable energies. What we've seen in Germany is that concerns about the economic structures of today, the concerns about climate change, the concerns about what kind of energy systems we should have led to major discussions about how do we transition towards more sustainable societies. And there's been another kind of transition going on, which I would call as a transition in democracy. Because in Germany today, there is a very strong demand for changing how we do decisions and making decisions much more public, much more open. And we've seen also since Fukushima new efforts also on the part of the federal government, but also on the part of state governments to have more town hall meetings, to have more decision making that includes the public in thinking about priorities and decisions and where to go, but also as a way of communicating changes that can be made. And I wanted to just end my talk with talking a little bit about another transition that happened in Germany, in this case in East Germany. East Germany was one of the most polluted places on the planet in the 1970s. One of those particularly polluted areas was Bitterfeld. This was an area where we had very heavy toxic pollution. It was an area of very serious coal mining and runoff from the coal mines. So a combination of chemical pollution and the pollution from the coal mines. You had entire areas outside of Leipzig and outside of Bitterfeld that look a little bit like the landscape of the moon. Strip mining that completely destroyed the natural vegetation. Areas where entire villages were destroyed in order to take the coal out of the soil. And this is what is now happening in these regions. It has been a transition that's taken about 20 years of trying to slowly clean up the pollution, clean up the soil, replant trees, and find a way to have new economic activities in the community. And when I saw what's going on here in Fukushima, I thought, you know, there are some similarities to what happened in this region of Germany. Of course, there wasn't the radioactivity, but extremely serious toxic pollution. And the efforts and the cost of making this transition have been enormous. But it's been done with the goal of having a future for this region and to make this region once again attractive. And I think this is the challenge that Fukushima has in front of it now. Maybe I'll just skip that last slide there and say what we need in our societies are thinking about how we can better make sure that major accidents don't happen. But when major accidents do happen, and they will sometimes happen, to think about how we can best deal with the risks of those accidents, and then to think forward about what kind of future do we want to establish, what kinds of possibilities are available for a region, and what kind of vision for the coming years do we want to develop. So I'll stop my presentation there because I've been given that 5-minute warning sign, and thank you very much for listening.